You're listening to Music Tectonics.
Hi, and welcome back to Music Tectonics, the podcast where we look at seismic shifts affecting music tech and music tech. My name is Tristra New Year Yeager. I am the irregular host here. I pop on now and then to talk to interesting folks from around the world about innovative ideas and big shifts coming in music technology. And today I have with me an amazing guest whose work I've been really admiring from afar. He has taken it on himself to gather information about the intersection between music, tech, and the climate crisis and ways to address climate change and other related environmental challenges that we face now as a species. So I would like to introduce Bas Grasmayer. And Bas has been involved in music tech for many, many years as a consultant, an advisor, and big thinker. Bas, I'll let you introduce yourself a little bit further. Can you share with our audience here a bit about what you do and how you approach music tech?
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you for having me on, first of all. So my background is largely in music streaming. So I worked for a few years in Russia on music streaming, trying to develop the market and build out reality of music streaming there, bring that to market there. I was heading up products for a service called Zvuk. Recently, I've been spending my time in Berlin heading up products for a startup called Idagio, which is a classical music streaming service. Specifically designed around the specifics of classical music. So Idagio I left a while ago, and I started my project back up, which is probably the thing that I'm most known for, which is called Music Tech Future, which is a newsletter on music and innovation. It's been going on for about 4 years with a short hiatus. And then recently something called Music X Green, which is about music and sustainability.
That is excellent. So first, let's talk about what in general folks are thinking about in this big field where sustainability and music and technology overlap. Where are some of the main areas that you've seen by just observing what's going on, or just from your own experience, where climate issues intersect with music and music tech? So, I mean, I can think of the live and touring space. Streaming and its carbon footprint has been talked about a lot. Vinyl and other physical products and their impact. What are some of the areas that you find most interesting and most challenging?
So, well, from a geeky perspective, I find festivals really interesting because the type of innovation around making a festival greener, even though it's very related to music as a context, making the energy grids more efficient, or maybe selling vegetarian stuff rather than meat, has very little to do with music. And that's where a lot of innovation can happen. So for me, that's interesting because it provides interesting angles to actually think about what are all the types of innovation that we can employ around music to be less impactful in a negative way and have a more positive impact on solving some of these problems that we have in terms of footprint.
That's a really interesting way to think about it, the positive impact. Usually we think about reducing the impact or footprint of festivals or tours. Have you noticed any interesting developments in terms of, almost like festivals as incubators for creative ideas, whether it's, coming up with a different way to serve beverages or single-use plastics, or are people changing the festival experience itself in a way that responds to sustainability in new ways?
So absolutely. And I think, unfortunately, Europe is quite a bit ahead, the good thing. And I say unfortunately also because it makes it really difficult for me to talk about the US. And I imagine there's quite a big US audience to this podcast. But the good thing is there's all these things that are already happening and you can more or less copy paste them. One thing I came across quite a few years ago, actually, quite before I was into this, deeply into this topic, was let's call it organization from the Netherlands called Open House. And what they were doing, they were kind of like a startup incubator that were connecting startups to festivals, and these startups were about sustainability, reuse, management of waste. And the reason why they would connect these startups, and then also NGOs, because when you do a festival, you have a few very unique aspects. You need to build a small city really quickly. You need to tear it down really quickly. And with that comes a lot of waste, a lot of energy use, a lot of planning. So if you can make along the whole chain of events, if you can make things more efficient, less wasteful, if you can reduce the amount of things you need, that's a really interesting playground to test out things. So open house still are doing things with the Red Cross, with festivals and events in the Netherlands, because they need that type of expertise and innovation to set up refugee camps. And then the other aspect I think that's really interesting of festivals, people go there and for a day or two or three, sometimes longer, you're in this kind of little fantasy world, and it can be a really inspiring experience. People are willing to try out different things. So if at a festival you can show people, here's what happens when you throw your rubbish in the right bin so that it gets recycled. We can make these things. It might inspire someone to do a little bit more, because it's really like they can see like right in front of their eyes how stuff can be recycled. Or I think a big one is maybe people will try out different foods. So there are some companies experimenting with creating insect produced food. Exactly. And it's really, really efficient. And maybe at a festival, if maybe people are a little bit tipsy or whatever, they're willing to try it, and they say, oh, that's fine. And same with vegetarian food, which might be scary, or might have like vegetarian food might have a bit of a stigma around it, because I don't know, maybe it might come across a little bit.
It's a great source of protein.
I don't know. I mean, I haven't eaten meat for like 10 years, but I understand that people are like, no, just give me a burger. I don't want like a mushroom burger. I just want normal old school beef.
There's a lot of culture baked into our food that, and we can sometimes set aside that baggage at a place like the festival where everything is suspended temporarily.
Right, and that might give people a trigger to change things in their personal lives after they've been there.
That's really cool. And I'm also imagining that festival organizers, as they're keeping an eye on sustainability, that they may be transforming the way they set up the experience, maybe changing shifting towards a more virtual set of virtual experiences instead of, say, building out a huge set like like some festivals do. They may be making some other changes that could shift the way we understand festivals.
Yeah, and there's some really there's an organization in Europe called I got to say their name right. I think it's called a Greener Festival, and they look at what are the greenest festivals in Europe. They recently handed out, or I think in the world actually, and they recently handed out some awards. And the ones that got like the top kind of certificates, they look like very, I haven't been there myself, but they look like very participatory type of events and festivals where there is music, but it's every stage is a little bit smaller scale. And instead of having like these huge shows where everyone's just kind of watching in a massive crowd, they try to make it smaller scale so that it's more of an event that happens together with the community rather than selling the band that is on stage, which is another way you can do things.
Excellent. As someone who's been in the streaming music world for a long time, since its inception, I'm wondering how you think about streaming in the sustainability context. I mean, on one hand, it helps with, physical objects require lots of energy and materials to produce and to tote around and store and throw away. Yet there's also a big problem with server farms. How do you think about this problem? And, what are some of the thoughts and dynamics you've observed from watching the sustainability space in music tech?
So that is like a good point. You make a really good point, and that's actually quite problematic. So it's estimated that right now the music industry, or the recorded music industry's climate footprint, CO2 footprint, is larger than it ever was, even at like the CD distribution heydays. And that's pretty, like that's bad. And it has a lot to do with the data centers. It has a lot to do with the fact that if you want to listen to music, there's got to be multiple computers running from the device that you listen on to wherever it's streaming from, and then maybe various things in between. So it's in a way quite power intensive. I think and most of the power gets used by the data center. So that's where the largest issue is. Also, data centers use a lot of water to cool themselves, and that water like just gets wasted too. So that's problematic. I'm slightly optimistic because it's concentrated to one rather specific but very big thing. So if you innovate in making data centers more efficient, in having data centers switch over to renewables, locating data centers in places where it's easier to have access to, let's say, cheap renewable energy, you can solve a lot of the problem. But also, music companies and music streaming services have to prioritize it. They have to say, okay, we'll pay a little bit more for our storage and for serving all the content to users, as it's called, streaming all the content to users. But at least it's green. And yeah, that's a little bit. I think that's a little bit difficult to negotiate, especially since it's about really, really huge quantities of data.
Yeah, and very thin margins from the streamer's perspective already. So taking a tiny bit more off the top to be sustainable sounds great, theoretically, but maybe really challenging from a business perspective.
Yeah, and by the way, when I say difficult, I don't mean it difficult in a negative way. It's just we have to figure it out. We have to do it, and we got to figure out how do we accomplish that. How do we maybe explain it to consumers in the case of potentially price rises? How do we get people who stream, or let's say music fans, how do we get them to have a basic expectation of certain standards around that so that they demand it from services? All of that, and like all of these things are possible. It just takes some work around like awareness side, but also around actually investing in the infrastructure that powers all these services.
That's a really excellent. I'm glad you're optimistic. I think optimism sometimes fails in these conversations, and just because their problems are daunting, but big problems are, they're just really big and they take time to address. And in some ways tech can help. It can also hinder, but we've got a lot of tools in play. Where do you feel in terms of sustainability writ large? And as you're thinking about music tech, what developments feel the most promising to you right now? What are you most optimistic about, most excited about? Where do you see the most hope for us to bring our love of music and music events into alignment with our values and need to address climate issues?
That's a very nice and very open question. What I think is really important for basically any organization in music is to appoint someone who's responsible for thinking of these topics. So very long ago, or actually not that long ago, maybe 15 years ago, organizations started doing this for like a digital person. Maybe it was just maybe it was the intern that had to start. Maybe it's 20 years ago, maybe 25. Maybe it was the intern. Maybe it was the intern that had to start thinking about these digital topics, or they were just the one talking about it. So that's how everyone kind of learned about it. Or maybe it was someone who was especially hired. It's like at some points, you got this chief digital officer role at all the major labels and also bigger indies. And I imagine we might see something around sustainability as a role also that becoming normal in these organizations. So what I'm very positive about, and why I'm focusing on that, is because the thing that I'm most positive about is that suddenly this conversation went from something quite obscure to something very normal. Like very quickly, this conversation about, let's say, sustainability or the climate or the footprints of the music business, very quickly did this conversation become a normal conversation to have, where people have a lot of questions and they're like, yeah, but what do we do? And kind of this feeling of powerlessness. But there's a lot happening, and I think it's very important that people are sharing information and expertise and insights, and that there are people at these organizations who, one, go solicit that, but two, can also spread their case studies and what they're learning, and maybe create collaborations with other organizations. So the live event sector is already doing this very well. I just stumbled upon a project in the UK. I think it's called Energy Revolution. What that does is it's like at least 100 partnered UK festivals, and they want to offset the audience travel emissions. So just like how you can do like the carbon calculator for traveling by plane, there's a lot of CO2 output by audience traveling to festivals. So they let audiences calculate this when they buy their tickets, and then they let them add a donation so that they offset their travel emissions related to the event. And that has like hundreds of festivals partnered up, and there's like quite a few initiatives like that. That's a live industry, and there's quite a lot has been happening there already for quite a while. And now you see the rest of the industry kind of getting involved and joining the conversation and figuring out, well, like, what can we do? And I think that's a very positive development.
I think you're totally right about the conversation going from nothing or just like totally on the outer fringes to the center. And it's amazing how quickly that's happening. And that is indeed something that inspires a lot of optimism in me. I mean, I'm an American, so like optimism is sort of like our default mode. But it's a very, very exciting thing to witness. Now, you've done an amazing job of trying to corral all of these different projects and approaches and ideas and products and services and put them into one place. Can you tell everybody how to find out more about your work, both on the music tech and the sustainability side?
Yeah. So, I mean, most relevant to this conversation is musicxgreen.com. What I've done there is when I started researching this topic, I actually found it kind of difficult. There was nobody consistently blogging about this. There was not like one place where I could find stuff. I did keep seeing the same studies and same examples and same organizations being mentioned in news articles. And I wondered, there has to be more. So I tried to start researching, and it wasn't as easy as many other topics that I've researched around music before and in the past. So I figured maybe I just build something to make it easier for everyone, because ultimately there is a lot of information out there, including on what you can do or who you can work with, services you can hire, potentially products you can get. And I wanted to just gather all of those things in one place so that if information travels faster, we can all improve faster. If we can learn faster, but we need to be able to see these things. And then at the same time, when I got back to writing my newsletter, I think I started it back up around the end of the summer. I think the landscape of what people are talking about now in terms of music and innovation is quite different from about 4 years ago when I started it up, where I felt everyone was just talking about streaming, but that was no longer, at least for me, that was not the new thing. And people were talking about like very specific things on major streaming platforms changing, and whether that's good or bad for artists. It's like, come on, we have to like think further. And like it felt like this whole generation of discourse that happened that was very innovative when these streaming services came up just kind of got stuck on that topic. So I started writing about, like, what about VR? What about chatbots? What about kind of modern versions of social media strategy? What are exciting startups doing? What about AI? Of course, nice topic. But then when I started my newsletter back up, I just felt there's so many really great people writing about it. And I think actually partially the Music Tectonics blog is doing some great writing. But also, I think first and foremost, Sherry Yu.
Oh, and, she's amazing.
Amber Horsberg writes really great things about like music marketing.
Mm-hmm.
Music Business Worldwide has some really great writing themselves and really great contributions. So for me, it didn't feel urgent to write about those topics because people are doing it anyway. So I started writing more about sustainability also in my newsletter, which just to answer your question, is called Music X Tech X Future. And if you add .com at the end of that, you can find it, and you can find like everything that I wrote.
Great. Yeah. And I encourage everyone to do that because, Boss, you are among the handful of people out there in English, at least, who are writing very deep thought-provoking pieces about the intersection of a lot of these different forces. And I really appreciate that some folks are taking the time to do the deep thinking, because I think that's really important. As you said, it's very easy to get caught up in feature obsession or like, oh, here's this other startup and this other startup and here's a startup. And you're like, what are they all doing? They all sound the same. Whereas taking a step back is often really, really useful. So it's a big service to the industry. Anyway, I really appreciate everything you've been doing on the sustainability front. Everybody go sign up and go and find out about all these cool projects going on around the world in sustainability. Add some of your own if you're working on that. And let's move this along so that, we don't all die. No, just kidding. Not to be in the podcast on a positive note. So, Boss, is there anything else you want to share with us or before we say goodbye, or any other? I know you got another dance project too, that you're just like a project machine lately. It's like I've been really, I've been like, dang, this guy's not letting a moment go by without doing something interesting. So tell us about the one you just launched this month. Or by the time this podcast out, it might be last month. But was it Hard Dance Berlin? It sounded like a pretty amazing passion project as well. Is that okay to mention now? Or?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
So like I kind of set a goal for myself. I want to launch 12 projects this year, like kind of on the side, just kind of hack something together. It can be something big, can be something small. But the only way I'm going to do 12 is if it's topics that I'm really passionate about, that I already know something about, and that I understand. What problem am I solving? Are there people like me, and what do we need? So the very brief version, there's a trend in electronic music where I don't know if probably also in the US where you see like harder styles of music and faster styles of music kind of surging in these music scenes. Once more, I think this was a trend. As we actually in the Netherlands we saw it in the 90s. There was like this mainstream genre called gabber, and it was huge. There's a whole subculture around it. And anyway, people are like borrowing those aesthetics, and it's kind of coming back. And I figured, well, if this is happening, and I was meeting people I'm speaking to, they should also know about like the underground scenes around it, because I felt people are very stuck to their own little kind of scene and corner in that, while in a city like Berlin, where there's a lot of electronic music culture, there was a lot of things going on there. So I figured, let's make a listing. Let's list all the DJs. Let's list all the events. Let's build a calendar so that also we're not completely dependent on Facebook events. Let's make sure that people can have like a really wide overview of all the different things that are happening in this scene. And I also started like a social media channel around it, where I'm just spending a couple minutes a day updating people on like, look, this artist has this music out, there's these events happening, and really trying to create like a kind of cross-scene community around these types of music and just create visibility for each other, because like we have to fight for our music scenes, and sometimes it's hard to understand how can you participate or what can you do for your music scene to be successful. I think the most important thing is just promote what everyone is doing, show up whenever you can. I'm 34, so it's like I don't really want to go out every weekend necessarily, or maybe even multiple days in the week. But so I do what I can, and I'm good from behind a computer. So that's what I've done there.
Awesome. Well, I'll look forward to seeing what other little projects you launch, and big projects. And thank you so much for your time and for your insights. Looking forward to reading more soon on the sustainability front. This is Trista Neuer-Jaeger, the head writer and strategist at Rock, Paper, Scissors. And you've been listening to Music Tectonics. You can follow us on our blog, musictectonics.com. And we have just announced our conference, which is coming up in LA in October. So everybody come check it out, come get your badge, and we can have fun conversations like this in person. Thanks again, Boss, for your time, and take care.
Thank you.
You're listening to Music Tectonics.